Ashes rolled into a blunt and smoked to get high, with a friend's remains. Rumor has it that's exactly what happened to the victim of today's assassination. It's September 1996, a Saturday night in Las Vegas. The Strip is packed, lights flashing, horns blaring, every corner vibrating with glitz and hustle. Inside the MGM Grand, a sold-out crowd watches Mike Tyson step into the ring. And in the front row, wearing a white tank top, gold chains, black jeans, and his signature front-tie bandana, sits Tupac Shakur, rapper, actor, and activist. Beside him is Suge Knight, head of Death Row Records. They aren't just label mates. Their bond runs far deeper than business. The East Coast versus West Coast hip-hop rivalry has escalated beyond lyrics. Now it's bullets, bodyguards, and rising body counts. A war is unfolding, and these two are soldiers fighting on the same side. Around 11 p.m., Tupac and Suge climb into a black BMW. Suge is behind the wheel, and Tupac takes the front passenger seat. Their bodyguards follow behind in separate cars. They cruise through the Vegas night, music up, windows down. At one point, police pull them over for loud music and missing plates. The stop is brief, and they're quickly back on the road. Minutes later, they roll up to a red light beside a car full of women who recognize Tupac and start shouting his name. He leans out the window, smiling and joking with them. Then a white Cadillac pulls up on the passenger side. Its rear window rolls down, and a hand reaches out, holding a firearm. "Hello, my friend. I'm Alan Bahari, and this is Assassins, the show where we explore the stories behind history's most shocking assassinations. Today, we're not talking about a politician, a general, or a king. We're talking about a rapper. Well, sort of, because calling Tupac Shakur a rapper is like calling Muhammad Ali a boxer. True, but nowhere near the full picture. Tupac was a poet, a performer, and a radical thinker. He lived only 25 years. Yet in that short time, he became one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. His voice cut through the noise with both fury and compassion. His songs weren't just about the streets. They were about systems, poverty, policing, and racism. And then, one night after a fight in Las Vegas, he was shot 4 times and left for dead. The investigation went nowhere. Witnesses disappeared. People who were at the scene stopped talking. Some of them because they were no longer alive. For decades, one question hung in the air. Who killed Tupac Shakur? This is his story. How he lived, how he fought, and how, nearly 3 decades later, his murder is still being examined, untangled, and fiercely debated. Tupac Amaru Shakur was born in East Harlem in 1971. His name was no accident. His mother, Afeni Shakur, was a member of the Black Panther Party. She was pregnant with Tupac while on trial for conspiring to bomb department stores and police stations. She defended herself in court, and she won. When her son was born, she gave him the name of a revolutionary. Tupac Amaru II, a Peruvian dissident who led a rebellion against the Spanish and was executed for it. Tupac's childhood was shaped by activism, instability, and constant government surveillance. The FBI kept a file on his family. His stepfather, Mutulu Shakur, went underground after being indicted for robbery and murder. His godfather, Geronimo Pratt, served time for a crime he did not commit. Throughout his youth, Tupac moved frequently, eventually landing in Baltimore, where he studied acting and ballet at the School for the Arts. He read Shakespeare, wrote poetry, and developed a magnetic mix of charisma, anger, brilliance, and poverty that defined his early years. The rise of Tupac. At 17, he moved to California and joined the hip-hop group Digital Underground. His first role was as a backup dancer, but he wasn't destined to stay in the background. By 1991, he stepped into the spotlight as a solo artist in his own right. A quick note, the ABC can't afford to license Tupac's actual music for this episode. So until we secure some of those bluey dollar bucks, you'll be hearing the closest approximation our production music library can muster. Something that aims to capture the sound and spirit of Tupac's timeless beats. His debut album, Tupacalypse Now, was political, raw, and unfiltered. Songs like Brenda's Got a Baby and Trap confronted issues deeply familiar to Tupac and his audience: teen pregnancy, police brutality, and institutional racism. Vice President Dan Quayle called the album a dangerous society, and Tupac loved that. He followed it up with Strictly for My Nigaz and kept rising, but his problems rose with him. He was sued. He was arrested. He got into fights. He was attacked by the media, adored by his fans, and feared by the establishment. Meanwhile, Hollywood came calling. Tupac starred in Juice, Poetic Justice, and Above the Rim. He was magnetic on screen, an undeniable presence. Studios wanted more of him, but the streets wanted him too. The hip-hop rivalry. Tupac's rise to fame unfolded just as an infamous music feud was igniting. The East Coast versus West Coast hip-hop rivalry. To understand Tupac's story, you have to understand this rivalry. Hip-hop was born in the early 1970s on the streets of the Bronx in New York City. The culture and music that emerged there came from the East Coast, giving many East Coast rappers a sense that their music was superior to anything created elsewhere in the U.S. or anywhere else in the world, for that matter. But throughout the 1980s and early 90s, the West Coast hip-hop scene was booming, fueled by artists like NWA and Dr. Dre. Dre co-founded Death Row Records alongside Suge Knight, and by the early 90s, West Coast artists were growing tired of what they saw as East Coast arrogance. At the center of the East Coast scene was Sean Puff Daddy Combs, founder of Bad Boy Records, home to artists like the Notorious B.I.G. For a while, the two coasts traded diss tracks, songs meant to call out, mock, or humiliate their rivals. But eventually, the feud spilled out of the studio and into the real world in very real, very dangerous ways. By the early 1990s, Tupac was famous, but his life was starting to spin out of control. He was being watched constantly by East Coast rivals, by the police, by the media, and he knew it. He wore a bulletproof vest to interviews. He'd say things like, "I might not live to see next week." People thought he was being dramatic. Tupac's legal battle. In 1993, while filming Above the Rim, Tupac was accused of sexually assaulting a 19-year-old woman in a hotel room. 3 other men were allegedly involved. The victim claimed she was forced to perform oral sex while Tupac watched. Tupac insisted the encounter was consensual and said he'd fallen asleep before anything happened. Yet he was charged with weapons possession, sexual abuse, and sodomy. This was only the beginning of a young rapper's troubles. Late one night in November 1994, Tupac arrived at Quad Recording Studios in Manhattan. He was scheduled to appear in court the next day to face those charges. But first he had promised to record a verse for a friend. He entered the studio lobby with his brother-in-law and one of his closest friends. As they arrived, a few members of an East Coast crew associated with the Notorious B.I.G. and Bad Boy Records shouted greetings to Tupac. Moments later, as Tupac and his friends stepped inside, they were confronted by 3 armed men who ordered them to get on the ground. Tupac hesitated, and they shot him 5 times. Once in the head, once in the groin, once in the thigh, and twice in the arm. The attackers stole $40,000 worth of jewelry and vanished into the night. It was nothing short of a miracle, but Tupac survived. As he was taken away on a stretcher, Tupac allegedly flipped a bird at the East Coast crew present. The next day, ignoring medical advice, he checked himself out of hospital and appeared in court in a wheelchair for the sexual abuse hearing. He was acquitted of the sodomy and gun charges, but convicted on 2 counts of first-degree sexual abuse. To remain out of jail until sentencing, Tupac faced bail set at a staggering $3 million. Unable to post the amount, he surrendered to authorities. From behind bars, Tupac gave interviews, claiming that the Quad Studios shooting was a betrayal and that Puff Daddy and the Notorious B.I.G. had been involved. On the surface, it sounded implausible. Biggie and Tupac had been friends, performed together, and Biggie had even spent time at Tupac's house. But according to Tupac, too many details didn't add up. Was it really a coincidence that Puffy and Biggie were in the same studio that night? And why did Biggie release a song called Who Shot You just months after Tupac was attacked? Puffy and Biggie insisted it was merely coincidence, but Tupac wasn't convinced. The East Coast, West Coast hip-hop rivalry was escalating. A clear example came in August 1995 at the Source Awards in New York City. Suge Knight, head of Death Row Records, took the stage and declared, "If any artists out there want to be artists and want to stay a star and don't want the executive producer all in the videos, all on the records dancing, come to Death Row." The crowd gasped. Suge was openly calling out Puffy, who was notorious for appearing in his artist videos and improvising on their tracks. Puffy was at the award ceremony that night, and Suge's call-out did not sit well with the East Coast crowd. They booed Suge and later jeered Dr. Dre when he won Producer of the Year. Puffy took the mic later in the evening, calling for calm in the East Coast, West Coast rivalry, but it did little to ease tensions. In the months that followed, the conflict escalated. At a party in Atlanta, a man close to Suge, Jake Robles, also known as Big Jake, was shot and killed. Both camps were present, and Suge accused Puffy of orchestrating the attack. Meanwhile, Tupac remained in prison, his career on hold. Buried under legal fees, surrounded by enemies, and losing hope, he seemed trapped. That's when Suge Knight appeared, the larger-than-life head of Death Row Records. 6 feet 4 inches, over 130 kilograms, always clad in red, always flanked by muscle, visited Tupac in prison with an offer. Death Row would post his bond if Tupac signed a 3-album deal with the label. Tupac agreed. By October 1995, after 9 months behind bars, Tupac walked out of Clinton Correctional Facility and into the embrace of the most feared label in hip-hop. Suge had flown across the country and even hired a limo to pick him up. Tupac was back, and he went straight to the studio. In just 2 weeks, Tupac recorded most of All Eyes on Me, a double album that would become his biggest commercial success. It was angry, loud, and defiant. Tupac sounded like a man who knew his time was limited and didn't care who he offended. Then came the track Hit 'Em Up, the B-side to his single How Do You Want It? On the surface, it was a diss track responding to Puffy and Biggie's Who Shot You, but it was more than that. It was a targeted threat. On the track, Tupac accused Biggie of copying his style, being soft and fake. Most explosively, he claimed, "You claim to be a player, but I F*** Ed your wife," referring to Biggie's wife, Faith Evans. The song wasn't clever. It was cruel. Tupac wasn't just calling out Bad Boy Records. He was trying to humiliate them. East Coast versus West Coast was no longer just a headline. It had become dangerous, real-world dangerous. Yet the records kept selling, the headlines kept coming, and Tupac kept pushing. He was fearless, maybe reckless, but above all, he believed in loyalty to Suge, to Death Row, to the West Coast, even if it ultimately cost him his life. The assassination. Which brings us back to that Saturday night in Las Vegas. Suge and Tupac are stopped at a red light. Tupac is flirting with some women in a nearby car. Suddenly, a white Cadillac pulls up on the passenger side. The rear window lowers, and a hand emerges, holding a firearm. 13 shots are fired. Bullets tear through Suge and Tupac's car. Tupac is hit 4 times, once in the arm, once in the thigh, and twice in the chest. 1 bullet lodges in his right lung. Suge is grazed by shrapnel but remains conscious. He floors it, swerving through traffic and making a U-turn. Just a few kilometers later, the police pull him over. Seeing the blood, officers call for paramedics. One leans in and asks Tupac who shot him. Allegedly, Tupac looks up and says, "Fuck you." He is rushed to University Medical Center. Doctor performed multiple surgeries and even remove a lung. Tupac ends up on life support and never regains consciousness. Tupac was shot at one of the busiest intersections in Las Vegas. The Strip was packed. Dozens of people witnessed the white Cadillac speeding away. Despite the number of witnesses, no arrests were made. From the beginning, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department treated the case as gang-related. To the police, it was just another violent feud spilling onto the streets. Dangerous, chaotic, and nearly impossible to untangle. Officers spoke to members of Tupac's entourage, but most refused to cooperate. Some claimed they hadn't seen anything. Others simply walked away. There was a deep distrust of law enforcement, and no one close to Tupac wanted to be seen talking to the police. Aftermath. The day after the shooting, Orlando Anderson, the man Tupac and his crew had beaten after the Tyson fight, was brought in for questioning. The altercation with Tupac, just hours before the shooting, had been caught on surveillance cameras. Anderson denied any involvement in Tupac's assassination, and the police chose not to pursue the matter further. Within days, the case began to stall. Leads dried up, and public attention shifted. There was talk of retaliation, and about 6 months later, another assassination would shock the world. In March 1997, Christopher Wallace, better known as the Notorious B.I.G., was gunned down in Los Angeles under eerily similar circumstances. A black vehicle, a busy street, a flurry of gunfire. He died instantly. And once again, no one was held accountable. Tupac and Biggie, friends turned rivals, turned symbols of something far bigger than themselves. Their murders are often thought of as twin tragedies, the unsolved heart of a cultural war, between coasts, between gangs, and between empires. Conspiracy theories. The question surrounding Tupac's death never stopped. Conspiracy theories flooded documentaries, podcasts, and internet forums. Some claimed he faked his own death and escaped to Cuba. Others pointed to the government or the LAPD. Some blamed Suge Knight, and others blamed Puff Daddy. Everyone had a theory, but no one had proof. Even now, nearly 30 years later, the full truth remains out of reach. Tupac was killed on September 13, 1996. He was 25 years old, and his body was cremated. According to members of his group, the Outlaws, they took a portion of his ashes, rolled them into a blunt, and smoked them as a tribute. Whether or not this actually happened doesn't really matter. The symbolism was enough. Tupac had become more than a person. He had become a force. Tupac's legacy. In the years that followed, his influence only grew. His music continued to be released. Old interviews resurfaced. His face appeared on murals, T-shirts, and at protests. People didn't just mourn him, they celebrated him. They studied his words, quoted his lines, and shared his vision. Tupac became a symbol of defiance, resilience, and brilliance. But not everyone agreed on what he represented. Some saw him as a prophet, others as reckless, and some as a martyr. The one thing no one ever said was that he didn't matter. Tupac once said he might not change the world, but he would spark the brain that does. Perhaps, in the end,